Good afternoon. It's a beautiful Sunday here in my city. I'm out in a park again because I just love being outdoors and in nature when I'm recording these. The shadows might be a little funky. Hopefully you can see my face all right. We will find out later in the tests, right? It's a little tough for me. I'm using my laptop to record, so the video is probably going to turn out a little differently. I've got some editing software on my laptop, so I'm hoping to get a little more professional with some of these videos. Anyway, this week's title is Ecological Ethics, Animals and Their Environment. This is in honor of Earth Day, which happened this past week, and I just want to talk for a bit about caring for our environment, caring for the animals in our environment, caring for our planet, and how that's important to me. And I just want to share some things that I'm doing to try to better care for animals and for the environment, and talk a little about the ethics of it. So I thought I'd begin with reading what has to be certainly in the Western world, one of the most famous passages on nature that exists. And it's from the Bible. It's from Genesis chapter 1. And this is a story of creation. This is an ancient Jewish story of creation. There are many, many different stories of creation in many cultures around the world. This is one of them. In my country, America, it's probably the most famous. So I'm just going to take a minute here and read Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So, ecological ethics. That passage is obviously had a tremendous impact on Western culture. I don't think any historian or anthropologist or just normal human could argue with the impact, I should say, could argue with the fact that the Bible has had a tremendous impact on our society. Whether you like the Bible or not, whether you trust it or not, whether you believe all of it's true or not, whether you look at it as more mythical and legendary, a work of literature, a human work, a divine work, however you view it, I don't think you can argue with the fact that it's had a tremendous impact on our culture. And one concept I want to focus on in particular there is this idea of dominion. So, the author of Genesis here presents the idea that humans specifically were given a responsibility to rule over all of the other living creatures on the earth. So I don't think we can talk about ecological ethics without realizing that at least part of our inclination to care well for our environment and for the animals in it may come from that principle, that we are given the responsibility as humans to care for other animals, to rule over them. Now certainly that idea has been abused, and that's where a lot of the ethical discussions come into today, because that idea has been abused over and over again. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and about how we can do better. Before I jump too far into that, though, I would like to read a few definitions. These are some quotes from Wikipedia defining ethics and ecology. So, according to Wikipedia, ethics, or moral philosophy, is a branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior. So as it relates to ecology, that would mean what is the right way for us to interact with our environment, to interact with other animals, other humans, and what would be the wrong way to interact. This is where a lot of discussion would come in. So, defining ecology. What is ecology? Again, according to Wikipedia, ecology, from the Greek oikos, meaning house, and logia, meaning study of. Ecology is the study of the relationships between living organisms, including humans, and their physical environment. That's pretty self-explanatory. How do we interact with our physical environment? Now, obviously, living organisms would include plants. You see a lot of plants around me. They do interact with the physical environment. Wikipedia says further, this is from the same entry. I'm going to include these quotes and their links in my description. Ecology addresses the full scale of life, from tiny bacteria to processes that span the entire planet. Ecologists study many diverse and complex relations among species, such as predation and pollination. The diversity of life is organized into different habitats, from terrestrial, middle, to aquatic ecosystems. I am obviously standing on a terrestrial, or earthly, if you will, ecosystem. It's on a smaller scale than the oceans, obviously, but there is an aquatic ecosystem actually right behind me. There's a creek running through. You can't really see it from this angle, but it's like about 20 feet from me here. It's winding through this land. So that would be an aquatic ecosystem, the fish and turtles and the bacteria and whatever else might live in there, crawdads, I don't know. I haven't seen one in there yet, but I have seen turtles in this particular creek and small fish. And then you have the terrestrial ecosystem. Obviously we humans, primarily live in terrestrial ecosystems. That's where we live and move most of the time. I'm sitting on land right now, on Earth. I'm sitting on a fallen tree, actually. So you have these organisms, including humans, and resources, further says, compose ecosystems, which in turn maintain biophysical feedback mechanisms that moderate processes acting on living, or biotic, and non-living, abiotic components of the planet. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms in conjunction with the non-living components of their environment, interacting as a system. These biotic and abiotic components are linked together through nutrient cycles and energy flows. So that's something I want to talk about next. How we are all linked together. Members of an ecosystem are linked together. We are all interconnected. I've talked about this before. I've talked about the concept of symbiosis. Just to use an example, the trees around me, and I'm assuming many of you know this, but for those of you that don't, this is pretty awesome. This is an example of how I as a human interact with the trees around me, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this field, but just my understanding, when I breathe in oxygen and then my lungs process it, what my body needs from that oxygen is distributed through my bloodstream. I then expel what is for me waste, that is in the form of CO2, or carbon dioxide. Too much of that is toxic for any human. But plants, trees in particular, as I understand it, like their leaves absorb that CO2. And I don't know all the chemistry behind this, the biochemistry. So, as I said, I'm not an expert, but my basic understanding is that somewhere in that process of their leaves absorbing the CO2, and photosynthesis plays in there somewhere as well. The chloroplasts inside the leaves play a part in all of this as well, I think. But one of the byproducts of the tree processing that CO2 and getting energy from the sun and all of that is that the leaves themselves, and they're talking right now. They want to enter this conversation. I love that sound, by the way. Just let's listen for a minute. Pretty awesome, right? I'm just waiting for an ant to walk across the field here. So I'm going to keep talking. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Sorry about the wind. I'm enjoying it. I know it's a little annoying when you're listening to a video. But the trees, their leaves, produce oxygen. And as I understand it, the rainforest in particular produce the majority of the world's oxygen, the majority of the world's breathable oxygen. So that's an example of a symbiotic relationship. I'm assuming the tree could not survive without CO2, which humans, human exhalation is obviously not the only source of CO2. So if we died off, the trees would probably be fine. But there is a symbiosis there. I can't survive without the oxygen that the trees produce. So in some ways, I'm more dependent on these trees than they are on me, because there's plenty of other organisms that exhale CO2. There's other, I think, natural sources of CO2. So if the human species were to die off, I'm sure it would affect some trees, but they'd probably be fine. But if we were to cut down all of the trees, if we were to hack through and deforest the entire planet, or do something to the environment that killed off the majority of the trees or the rainforest, we humans would slowly asphyxiate and die. That's how dependent we are on the trees. So that's an example of the ecosystem. So how we treat trees is important. We need to make sure there's enough of them around. Otherwise we and other animals that breathe oxygen, other mammals, even fish to some extent breathe oxygen, albeit with inside the water. They draw it out of the water with their gills. Again, I don't know all the ways that works, but so it behooves us to take good care of our forest, right? That's really important. So an example of what we can do is that we could buy our wood products from lumber companies that emphasize sustainable forestry, for instance. They don't just, to put it crudely, rape the natural world. They cut down the trees they need, but they also replant, which honestly is a good business model for them, so it just makes sense. But they replant, so there's the cycle of life continues. Or another example of a sustainable option is buying products made of bamboo, because you don't have to cut a bamboo plant down to harvest enough to build something with. I just bought some coasters. I was looking for something that was sustainable, and I found some, and they're made out of bamboo. And as I said, you don't have to kill the bamboo plant in order to harvest enough to make something out of it. So that's just another example. So that's an example of how we treat trees, how we treat the forest. What about how we treat animals? I've thought about this in different ways my whole life. I think the first animal I ever owned was a fish. It was a goldfish, a little goldfish. I had one of those little goldfish bowls, and my fish was named Michael. And that was also the first time I remember interacting with death, because Michael died eventually. We buried him in the backyard in a little Tic Tac container. I think we even had like a little, we didn't have a eulogy or anything, but like there was a little bit of ceremony to it. Like we put him in this little empty Tic Tac container, and we buried him in the backyard. And I remember crying. I think I was like 6 or 7. That's the first pet I remember owning. At that same house, we found I think it was a box turtle in the backyard, and we kept that for a little while. But my first real pet was my dog Bandit, and I love my dog. We adopted him from the Humane Society. He was about 2.5, 3 years old when we adopted him, and sadly, from what we could tell, his previous owner had been abusive, because for several years after we adopted him, anytime a man with a mustache came near him, he would just cower. He would put his tail between his legs and he would cower down, because some bees are checking me out here. He would cower down because he had been mistreated by his previous owner, which was really sad. Another consequence of that is he did not bark for the first 2 years I owned him. For the first 2 years I took care of Bandit. He's a border collie, by the way. Beautiful dog. I think it was a mix between a border collie and a rough collie, because unlike most border collies you see, you have solid black. They're a little shorter or squattier, and they have like white boots, if you will. He was more of like the patches of black, and he was a little taller, so he looked more like a small rough collie, but with black patches of fur instead of kind of the golden or tan. Anyway, beautiful dog, very intelligent. But the first 2 years I had him, he didn't bark. And I suspect that that was a result of trauma. He was probably beaten by his previous owner when he barked too much, which is really sad. But we, I think about 2 years in, we went away on sort of a little, like, kind of, sort of a mini vacation type thing. But we went away on a trip as a family, and we were gone for, I think, 5 weeks. And he stayed with a family that had a sheepdog, and this sheepdog barked a lot. And it's like it woke him up. And after we came back, he started barking. He didn't have a problem barking anymore. So he would, like, cars came by, he would run around the backyard, barking at the cars or barking at other dogs. It woke him up. Like he found his voice after it helped him recover from the trauma of being abused by his previous owner. But I love that dog, man. Like that dog was my friend. Like there were nights, and I've talked about my battles with cancer with my mom. There were nights during those 4 or 5 years where first year she had it, we didn't know that it was cancer. And then from the time of her diagnosis to the time of her death was about 4 years. So it was a long period there where we were just uncertainty. We don't know how long mom's going to have. So there were a lot of nights I remember I would just go out on the back porch, and nights in Arizona are gorgeous. Like even in the summer when it's like 100 degrees, once the sun goes down, because it's not humid, the temperature drops like 20-30 degrees, and it's just beautiful outside even in the summertime. So I would just sit out there. We had like a porch swing. I would just sit on the porch swing. Bandit would come and lay down next to me or sit next to me. I would pet him. Sometimes I would talk to him. Sometimes I would pray. I would just sit out there and think. I would look at the stars, and he's my buddy. He would just sit there with me. And my mom died in 2001. I think it was 2004. So I had Bandit another 3 years after my mom passed away. And Bandit, he was probably about 14 years old at that point, and he eventually died. And that hit me pretty hard. Like that was rough. I love my dog, and so I learned how to care for an animal in that circumstance. And over time, particularly in the last couple of years, I've thought more and more about some of the more intelligent animals that we eat, and how it's a little weird, right? Like to think about pigs in particular. From what I understand, and I'm not a biologist, so I'm not an expert, but from what I have heard, pigs are every bit as intelligent as a dog. Maybe with the exception that they're not as good at escaping a bad situation. Obviously. Maybe it's the short legs, I don't know. But pigs are very intelligent. And they are, in that sense, have a higher degree of sentience than, say, a fish. Or even a chicken. Other animals that we eat. So I've thought about in relation to their capacity for suffering. If you have a larger brain, a pig has a larger brain than a chicken, obviously. More intelligent. So they are more capable, as I understand it, more capable of being aware of, even if it's just in the moment, they're more capable of being aware of their suffering. I don't know the extent at which they can be traumatized and remember that trauma. I know that was certainly true for my dog, because he had been abused by his previous owner. It took him at least 2 years to recover from that trauma. Being with owners who treated him better. It took 2 years, and finally, like, being with another dog who felt the freedom to bark and run around like a sheepdog, because border collies are sheepdogs. For him to recover from that. So he obviously had a memory, I don't know to what extent that was like a cognitive memory or visual, but definitely his body remembered that trauma. So I suspect that pigs probably have a similar capacity, and I would assume probably cows as well. Chickens a little less so, I think, because they have a much smaller brain. I would assume a little bit less capacity for being conscious of their own suffering, and fish even less. They have even smaller brains. They can still suffer, they can still feel pain, obviously, but it's different than than when you are able to actually remember your pain and recall it. You know, it's different. Your body still stores the trauma, but in a different way. You're more aware of your own suffering. You can think about the fact that you have suffered. So I've thought about capacity for suffering and how that relates to how we should treat animals. And I've thought about, should we even eat them at all? Like, should we eat, especially, more intelligent animals like pigs or cows? And honestly, I haven't made a decision on that yet, because, where I'm at today, at least, you look at the environment around you, you look at nature, predation, which the Wikipedia entry mentioned that, like, basically predators and prey, like, that's kind of a normal part of the cycle of life. If cows were out in the wild and we weren't domesticating them and raising them up to be slaughtered so we can have beef, to eat, why do we call it beef, by the way? Why don't we just call it cow? Is it because we don't want to be reminded that it came from an animal? Kind of weird, right? We call chicken, but why do we call we're eating the muscles from a cow? Why do we call it beef instead of cow? Or pork instead of pig? Weird, right? Maybe on some level it is because we're aware of the fact that these are more intelligent animals, and we don't like to be reminded that we're eating an intelligent animal, an animal that is as intelligent as our dogs that we like to keep as pets, right? Because we have an aversion in our culture, at least, to eating dogs. I know some other cultures don't, but ours certainly does. Why is, we keep them as pets. Like, they almost become a member of the family in many cases. So why are we okay with eating pigs and cows and not dogs? Is it, But I'm still figuring that one out. I would not necessarily say at this point that I think it's immoral to eat cows and pigs, but I do think it is important to, even in the context of domesticating them and raising them up to eventually, be slaughtered for human consumption, I think it's important that, particularly given our level of intelligence and our ability to understand the effect that our actions have on other animals and the environment around us, like, we are more aware of that. We have, a higher intelligence. We have better memory systems than some of the lower animals, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I think it behooves us to do what we can to alleviate any unnecessary suffering for them. So, like, I said this to a farmer I was talking to a month or two ago. This is something I've started doing to try and, first I started transitioning to grass-fed beef. I would look for that when I went, and it's a little more expensive, but it's going down in price a bit, but I would start looking for grass-fed beef, cows because that's more their natural diet. It's healthier for them. It results in healthier meat, honestly, that tastes more like what it's supposed to taste like. A healthier growth rate for the cow. They get sick less often, so it's just better for them to eat what they would normally eat in nature, which is, they would primarily eat grass. So I started buying grass-fed beef, and I haven't looked into as much pigs, but just in general, what I've decided to start doing is going to farmers markets and buying my beef and my pork and my chicken, or at least my beef and my pork. At least my beef and my pork from farmers, And if I've done this twice now. I've gone to 2 farmers markets, and I've met some really amazing people. Like, these, in both cases, they were farmers that were working on a farm that had been in their family for multiple generations. The first gentleman that I interacted with, I think he said the farm that he was working had been in his family for 100 years. There was a woman and her daughter that I spoke to the second time. I went to a different farmer's market and got beef and pork from them. And they, I think it had been in her family for 5 generations, she said. And what I love about that is that I was able to, in both cases, I had like a 20-30 minute conversation with the farmers, and I just asked them questions about how they treated their animals, what farming is like, and we got to talking about the mistreatment that happens in more industrialized farming operations, where the cows are run through almost like an assembly line. They are put in very small paddocks. They don't have much room to roam around. They're not fed grass, which is something they would normally eat. They're fed more unhealthy things. They're given growth hormones and fed a diet that makes them grow at an unhealthy rate, so that within 1 year they grow to be like 1,500 pounds. Let's talk about cows, which a normal growth rate, would take them 2 years to get to about 1,200 pounds, according to these farmers I talked to. So they feed them the normal diet. They even take them up to another state, so that they can eat grass in the pasture at a certain time of year where it doesn't grow as much down here in our state. And they do their best to 100% grass feed them, either grass or hay. And they let the cows do their normal growth rate. They grow to full maturity in about 2 years, and then they slaughter them. And the way they slaughter them is as humane as it can be. There is it sounds a little rough, but I think they call it like a bolt gun. Basically, it shoots a bolt into the cow's brain. You have to be very precise, and apparently this is regulated, by the government as well. Like they monitor this very closely. You have to be very precise, and it shoots it into a very specific point in the brainstem, and then instantly kills the cow. And basically, they feel no pain, just instant death. Also, when there's no trauma, it results in them not being tensed up and stress hormones being shot into their muscles, which then would make the meat tougher, and it wouldn't taste as good anyway. But that's not really the main point for me. It's like that it's quick, it's painless. You've allowed them at least their normal growth cycle to maturity. Now, one thing that has given me some food for thought is if I asked the farmer, like, how long would a cow normally live, out in the pasture, and she said some could live up to 20 years. So I was like, dang. So we're cutting their life short by 18 years so that we can eat them. That gave me pause. I'm like, how ethical is that? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that yet. And I don't know what their life expectancy would be in the wild. If they're out in the wild with other predators, like, say a mountain lion or a bobcat, for instance, or a coyote. I don't know what their life expectancy would be out there. I think one could argue that they have better quality of life in a protected pasture for their lifespan than they would out there having to be constantly on the alert for potential predators coming up at any moment to literally eat them alive. You talk about trauma. So if you're gonna as a cow, if you're gonna be eaten by a predator, you'd rather be eaten by a farmer who treats you well and then kills you humanely, right? In a way that you don't suffer. So if a predator's gonna eat you, that's the way you'd want to go, right? But yeah, like the broader ethics, like I'm not sure, because like if we're gonna say it's immoral, then does that mean we need to then go and police other predators and say no, you can't eat cows? Like, I don't think that's a good idea, because we're gonna throw the ecosystem out of balance, and that will affect who knows how many other species. So we need to be careful when we play around with that stuff, and not. I think we need to be as conservative as possible in the way we tinker with the ecosystem. So to me, I think it all comes back to symbiosis. And to close up here, I wanted to, I began with a quote from the Bible, which kind of represents where I came from. And honestly, I'm very grateful for the ethic I was taught of the importance of caring for animals, of caring for the environment. I was not taught, at least in my tradition, the groups that I grew up in, I was not taught to abuse animals. I was not taught to just abuse the natural world. There was the concept of I think they would have used the term, being a good steward. In other words, this responsibility has been entrusted to us by our Creator. Therefore, we should do it well. We should do it wisely. And there were ideas of compassion and empathy for animals, even as we viewed humans as more important than animals, because we're created in the image of God according to Genesis. So that put humans above other animals in importance. Like we had an intrinsic value that was greater. I don't know that I agree with that anymore. That we have I would say that um, it makes sense to me that we humans should value other humans the most amongst the animals, if you will. That just makes sense. That's our own species, right? Like, why would we not value our own species the most? You know, our own species should get priority, right? Over other species. But not necessarily at the expense of all the other species, you know, within reason, of course. Anyway, I've been exploring other ways of viewing nature and of viewing God and the interaction between God and nature and the divine in nature. And one of the concepts I've been exploring is pantheism, and a kind of something related to it, panentheism. And I want to read a quick quote. This is the first and only book I've read thus far on the subject of pantheism. I actually highly recommend it. This is a guy who, like me, was raised a Christian, but just had so many experiences through his life, and just he explored many different religions, tried many different paths, and ultimately, you know, he kind of landed on naturalism, but then just I'll let him share it for himself, but eventually came to look at the divine more from a pantheistic perspective. So the book is A Reluctant Pantheism, Discovering the Divine in Nature. It's written by Walt McLaughlin, and I'm going to read a quote here. This is from, I think, chapter 13. Walt says, "Pantheism, I believe, comes as close as any worldview can to describing the relationship between God and the natural world, inasmuch as we can know such things. I should just call myself a pantheist and leave it at that. But, if pressed to it, I would have to admit to being a panentheist, simply because I'm convinced that the universe has evolved from a singularity in space-time, leading me to believe that all nature was created. A creation event clearly puts some aspect of God beyond nature. That makes God a phenomenon that transcends nature while still being a part of it. It's a paradox, to be sure. I use the word God very loosely, of course. I am unwilling to describe God's attributes in detail because any definition of the absolute is bound to fall short of the mark. Yet I remain deeply religious. That means I firmly believe that natural order exists, that some organizing force is hard at work in the universe. The idea of an utterly random universe makes no sense to me, nor does the animism of our distant ancestors, the gods of antiquity, or any anthropomorphic concept of God. Nor does the most abstract notion of ultimate being dreamt up by some modern sage or philosopher. Here I come to pantheism more by default than design. I profess a reluctant pantheism, one restrained by an abiding belief that, as a thinking member of the human race, I must confess knowing nothing for certain. More to the point, no credo ever invented has a corner on truth. Pantheism is no exception to this, nor is panentheism. Every worldview, religious or secular, has built into it the inherent flaws of the human mind, the pitfalls of pure reason, the illusory nature of the senses, and our wildly fluctuating emotions. Brief moments of divine encounter notwithstanding, there are no exceptions to the rule of unknowing. Pantheism is a natural religion. Though easily confused with nature worship or paganism, it is more a belief that the divine exists in nature, and that the best way to understand the natural world is through some combination of direct encounter and science. Quote, "The mass of mankind are not yet prepared for a religion based upon natural knowledge alone," unquote, John Burroughs once wrote. And that's as true today as it was a century ago. A great schism still yawns between religion and science, as if the reality of the world in which we live could only be understood one way or the other. Strictly religious and strictly secular thinkers conspire together against truth, presenting us with a choice that simply does not make sense. Either God exists and this world is an illusion, or God doesn't exist, and we are nothing more than the sum of our parts. That's a choice that neither I nor any other pantheist is willing to make. I really like that, and honestly, that's that's pretty close to where I'm living right now myself. So I think panentheist would probably be a good descriptor of kind of my orientation towards the divine, towards God, and towards nature itself. So I do see order, I do see organization, I see it in the natural information that exists, like DNA, for instance. How amazing is that? So I see that there, and I see the potential, at least, for, like he said, a creation event. Even though I no longer hold to the ideas of an anthropomorphic deity, as so many of our ancestors and so many people now still do. I just think it's so much bigger than that, and I think what he says there captures it pretty well, which is why I really like this book. I recommend it. Anyway, I went a little long today, a little longer than I planned, but I want to talk about this. I think it's important. It's important for us to care for our environment, to do little things like, oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. Like, another little thing I like to do, because I've learned about how many plastic bags end up in the ocean, that there's literally it's like a floating continent of plastic bags out in the Pacific Ocean, and that these things do unfortunately kill many of the animals, and it affects the ecosystem negatively. I'm trying to do my part. So when I go grocery shopping, I do my best to never use plastic bags. And honestly, it actually makes it a little easier for the people, for the cashier. So I tell them as I come up, is like, I don't use bags, I don't want plastic bags. So I will very quickly, because I don't want to be an inconvenience, I will very quickly put all my groceries, up on the conveyor. Then I tell them what I'm doing, and then I'll bring the cart around, so then they can just put the groceries right back in the cart. And I will help them as well. And we usually have a conversation, and it's led to like a good relationship with the cashiers that I've had. And then I keep a lot of reusable bags like this one out in my car, and then I go to the car and I just fill up all the reusable bags with my groceries or whatever other container I happen to have out there. Sometimes I forget them and I just throw it in the car, and then I put the buggy back. And that's a small decision. And I knew for years, like it's kind of in the back of my mind, like I need to do this, and I was just too lazy. And finally I was like, stop making excuses, just do it. So now I've gotten in the habit of it, and I actually really enjoy it, honestly. It gives me a little mini workout, because I'm like throwing the stuff on there quickly, and it's led to some cool conversations with the cashiers, and I feel like I'm making a difference. So even, just little small choices like that, small choices like buying my meat from a farmer where I can actually look them in the face and talk to them about how they're treating their animals. Small decisions like buying things like this. This is such a cool idea. Path water. This is not a promotion, by the way. They're not paying me to say this. I found this randomly in a convenience store. I live in the southeast, so I found this in a Sheetz convenience store. And basically what it is this is in the normal water bottle section, where all the plastic, like, I can't even think of the Aquafina or whatever, all the different ones out there. But this is in among them, and it is a reusable container, which you would think, well, that's not the best business model for them, right? But I love it because it's sustainable. Like, this is purified water, pH balanced with electrolytes. But this container, I've been using this thing for like 2 months. It's BPA free aluminum, and it's just really cool. And it's like starting a little movement. So it's like you buy it one time there, and you keep reusing it. And I was already doing that with just the normal plastic bottles. I would try to reuse them as much as possible. So just things like that, even down to like buying, like this computer I'm recording this with. This is a renewed or refurbished computer that I bought online, and it worked great. Or buying a used car instead of a new car, so that we put help to put a little bit less new cars out on the market. Because just stuff like that. we don't have to change the entire world at once. Just make it one small decision at a time, one day at a time, and we can make a difference. Next week, I'm going to get more into human ethics, like how we treat each other as humans. I'm going to talk more about a topic related to that. But as I said, in honor of Earth Day, I wanted to talk more about our relationship with the natural world and the ecosystem around us. And I hope this has been helpful. I've enjoyed it. It's been good for me. And with that, I am going to sign off for this week. So have a good week.